No one had entered the bell tower since 1966, until a skeleton was found chained beneath it. They weren't supposed to find anything. That's what everyone kept saying. The team was only there to strip the roof and inspect the damage. Standard procedure for an abandoned church slated for historic preservation. No one had opened the bell tower since 1966. The stairs leading up had collapsed long ago. The doors were nailed shut from the outside. No entry, no interest, no memory. For almost 6 decades, it had been a hollow crown over a forgotten building, until something shifted, until the roof peeled back, until a smell that didn't belong to wood or mold reached the edge of the scaffold, until Emma Ward looked down through the beams and saw something pale caught in the shadow. It began with a simple creak of metal, like a breath caught in the throat of a structure. Then came the smell, damp, iron-rich, something both ancient and strangely fresh. And then, beneath the dust, the silence, the stacked decades of abandonment, came the curve of something unmistakably human. Emma Ward had worked on dozens of preservation sites, fire-damaged mills in Michigan, colonial homes along the Hudson, a boarding school in Mississippi where kids' names were still scratched into the floorboards. She thought she knew the limits of what old buildings could reveal. But this was something else. She had arrived in St. Matthias only 3 days ago. A dot on the edge of nowhere, the church sat like a sunken ship at the end of a pine-flanked road, its white steeple grayed to bone. Emma had stood in the gravel lot that morning, boots crunching the frost, coffee cooling in her hand, while the crew joked and measured and cursed the brittle shingles. She hadn't laughed with them. She rarely did. Her work was quiet, careful. She listened to what the wood told her. Where others saw rot, she heard timelines. She hadn't planned to look into the bell tower. The plans didn't require it. Structurally unstable, verbally marked as off-limits. But as the shingles were removed and daylight poured down onto beams untouched in decades, she had climbed the narrow scaffolding just to peek inside, just to satisfy that itch, the one that whispered when something felt off. What she found wasn't a relic. It wasn't history. It was a violation, a break in the known. She didn't scream. She rarely did. But her breath caught like ice in her chest as she squinted into the gloom. Below the floorboards, tucked into the corner where brick met iron, was a shape wrapped in chain. Her flashlight flickered against it. White, rigid, curved. Not wood, not metal. A foot, a human foot. The chains laced around the ankle were orange with rust. The bones were mostly intact. The toes arched slightly, as if frozen mid-movement. As if whatever had happened hadn't been quick. Emma didn't speak. She climbed down. She radioed the foreman. Her voice was even. Her hands weren't. Within the hour, the county sheriff arrived. 2 deputies, 1 forensic tech. They taped off the stairs, jotted notes, took half-hearted photos. No press, no headlines, no sense of urgency. When Emma asked who it could be, if there were any old reports, any missing persons, the sheriff just shrugged. No one's been reported missing from this church. Not back then, not now. But you haven't identified the body. Skeleton, he corrected. And no, could be a drifter, Could be older than the building. It's chained to the floor, she said. He looked at her like she was being dramatic. Emma stood outside the bell tower long after they'd gone. The sun was sliding behind the trees, casting long shadows across the gravel. The air felt heavier now, as if the ground itself was holding its breath. The church loomed behind her, its boarded windows like shut eyes, the paint peeling from its frame like dried skin. But what chilled her wasn't the building, it was the absence. No one had missed him. No one had asked where he went. No police file. No family searching. No news clipping yellowed with time. How does a man vanish inside a church tower, chained, and have the world continue like he was never there? Emma wasn't religious. She had left that behind years ago, after her mother's slow decline and the priest who didn't show up at the hospital until it was too late. But she understood reverence. She understood injustice. And something about this silence, this forgotten death, felt like both. She returned the next morning with gloves. The crew was paused until further notice. She had time. The floorboards above the remains had been removed. She crouched on the edge, careful not to disturb the scene, and peered down again. The bones were discolored, weathered, but surprisingly complete. The right leg was shackled to an iron ring embedded in the stone. Whoever it was had been sitting when they died, maybe slumped, maybe collapsed. One arm curled in on itself. A small pile of tattered fabric remained near the rib cage, too degraded to identify. But once clothing, perhaps a robe, and near the shoulder, half covered in dust, was something small and silver. Emma lowered herself with a rope harness and retrieved it gently. A pendant, oval, thin, a figure of an angel, etched faintly into its surface. The chain had long since broken. She turned it in her fingers, the image barely visible through grime. It had the weight of something once cherished. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in her motel bed, the pendant on the nightstand, her laptop casting a pale glow against the wallpaper. She searched every digitized archive she could find: church records, local obituaries, missing person registries from the 1960s. Nothing. No name. No report. No trace. The only document of interest was a faded blueprint of the church's renovation from 1972. In the margin, scrawled in red ink, was a note next to the bell tower, sealed 1966. Do not reopen. No explanation. No signature. Just a warning. Or maybe a cover-up. Emma leaned back in her chair. The hum of the old motel heater, the only sound in the room. The glow from the laptop flickered across her eyes. She picked up the pendant and held it tightly. No name. No records. No voice left behind. But someone had been there. Someone who screamed loud enough to silence a bell. And someone had chosen to make sure the world would never hear it. Do not reopen. But she already had. The next morning came colder, as if the discovery had lowered the temperature across the town. Frost clung to the church steps, and the air smelled faintly of metal and pine. Emma stood at the edge of the caution tape, staring at the bell tower like it was staring back. The sheriff's department had already come and gone. They'd taken a few samples, snapped a few more photos, then handed off jurisdiction to the county coroner with the same energy you'd use to drop a shopping cart at the end of a parking lot. To them, it wasn't a crime scene, it was a delay. The body, no, she corrected herself, the man hadn't been removed. Not yet. The coroner's team wasn't scheduled until the afternoon, and no one seemed eager to expedite it. Emma had returned alone. She told herself it was to continue documenting the structural risk of the tower. But really, it was something else. The church had gone quiet again, unnaturally so. She needed to be near it, to see it with her own eyes, to confirm that what had been found hadn't simply dissolved overnight into one of those dreams that leaves you breathless at dawn. She walked carefully through the open nave, where dust floated like ash in morning light. Her boots clicked softly against the worn floorboards. The pews were still intact, rows of them facing a pulpit that hadn't echoed a sermon in over 50 years. Cobwebs laced the corners. A hymnal lay open on a bench, its pages curled inward like fingers. She passed the altar without pause and headed for the narrow corridor that led up toward the tower base. The wooden boards groaned beneath her step, old nails whispering warnings. At the tower's threshold, she stopped. The same outline of pale bones, the same rusted shackle clamped to a crumbling ankle. Only now, sunlight was seeping through the high slats in the wall, falling across the stones in long, broken stripes. The air was thicker here, colder than it should have been for a sealed space. She knelt just outside the taped perimeter and studied him again. Not as a curiosity, but as a person. The way his head had slumped to the left, the collapsed shape of his spine, the position of his hand, clutching his chest or perhaps reaching for something that wasn't there. The pendant she had taken lay in a sealed bag inside her jacket pocket. She didn't want to hand it over yet, not because she was hiding it, but because something about it felt unfinished. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel. A deputy stepped out of the cruiser, clipboard in hand, and approached with the kind of energy reserved for paperwork and coffee runs. "You Emma Ward?" he asked. She nodded. He handed her a form, already signed. "Statement request. Coroner's office will take over at noon. They want a full site report from you by Friday." Emma scanned the paper. "Is that all?" He hesitated. "Sheriff asked if you'd be willing to give up the necklace. Said it's probably irrelevant, but for protocol." She unzipped her coat slowly, pulling the bag from the inner pocket. The metal glinted faintly inside the plastic. Before she let go, she looked him in the eye. "There's no missing person report, no identity, no record. Does that not concern you?" He shrugged. "Happened a long time ago. Town's got old ghosts." Emma exhaled through her nose and handed it over. The deputy tipped his hat and walked off. No more questions. No urgency. Back in her car, parked under the pines behind the chapel, Emma scrolled through county archives on her laptop. She zoomed in on building permits, blueprints, census records. She searched for every death, every disappearance, every renovation proposal that mentioned St. Matthias between 1960 and 1970. Nothing about a fatality. Nothing about a burial. But then, tucked into a planning document from 1972, she found something that made her sit up. a hand-drawn map of the church, annotated in pencil, and later scanned for record. Every room labeled, every stairwell marked except one. The bell tower had no stair designation, no footnote, no measurement. But in red ink, distinct and deliberate, was a small circle around its base. And beside it, written in the same hand as the "Do Not Reopen" warning, were 3 words: entry permanently sealed. No explanation. No engineering concern. Just finality. Emma stared at the screen, rereading the note until the words blurred. Why seal off the tower? Why not list structural failure or safety hazard? And more importantly, why wasn't it ever reopened? Later that afternoon, she returned to the town records office to cross-check baptism logs and event reports from the church. The receptionist, a woman in her 60s with permed gray hair and a velvet blouse, offered a tight smile but no enthusiasm. "St. Matthias," she said, raising an eyebrow. "You're the preservation worker?" "Yes." "People say you found a skeleton up there." "I did." The woman hesitated, then pushed a bound ledger across the counter. "This one's from 65 to 68. We only have partial records. Some were lost in the 1989 flood." Emma opened the book slowly, the spine creaking like old wood. Baptisms. Weddings. Names carefully penned in cursive. She traced her finger down the margin, scanning each line. There were no deaths listed, of course, but halfway through the 1966 entries, something unusual appeared. A short note, written in a different hand, barely legible. "Bell tower locked by Father Kerrigan. Incident not recorded in log." Emma blinked. No date, no details. Just the acknowledgement that something had happened and that someone had decided not to write it down. She copied the note, closed the book, and thanked the woman. Her voice felt strange in her throat, like it belonged to someone else. That night, in her motel room, Emma lay awake again. The wind outside carried the faint howl of passing trucks along the highway. But inside was stillness. A kind of listening silence, like something was waiting for her to put the pieces together. She pulled out her notebook and flipped through her sketches. Floor plans, tower dimensions, beam stress marks. But what caught her attention wasn't structural. It was the man's posture, the leg chained, the arm bent awkwardly, the way his spine twisted slightly away from the tower's center, as if he'd spent his final moments not screaming, but praying. She swallowed hard and looked out the motel window. No storm, no lightning, just night. And somewhere out there, an old bell tower still holding the breath of a man no one remembered. But she remembered, and tomorrow she would go back. She had more questions now, and she no longer trusted anyone else to ask them. The diner was nearly empty by the time Emma stepped inside, the bell above the door ringing out against the soft hum of a jukebox that hadn't been changed since the Reagan years. She ordered black coffee from a waitress with cloudy blue eyes and hair teased into a memory, then took a booth near the window. The condensation on the glass turned the outside world into soft watercolor. Vague trees, parked trucks, a church spire far in the distance, barely visible through pine and fog. She opened her notebook, flipped past floor diagrams, stopped at the red ink copy of the ledger note. Bell tower locked by Father Kerrigan. Incident not recorded. She didn't know who Father Kerrigan was, but someone must have. The waitress returned with a chipped ceramic mug and leaned in slightly, studying Emma's notes. "You the one poking around St. Matthias?" Emma looked up. "I am." "Found a body, they say." Emma didn't answer. The woman didn't wait for one. "My cousin used to sing in that choir," she added. "Back in the 60s. Said it was the kind of church where you didn't raise your voice too loud, even if you were praying." Emma folded the notebook closed. "Do you remember a Father Kerrigan?" The woman nodded slowly. He was the last full-time priest before they closed the place. Tall, real quiet. Moved out west in the 70s, I think. Or so folks said. Some thought he lost his mind. Others thought he just saw something he couldn't preach through. Emma sipped her coffee. It was terrible. She drank it anyway. She returned to the church that afternoon, this time not to observe, but to listen. She walked along the side of the nave where the pews bent in prayer-like posture, her fingers tracing the edges of the wooden hymnals, worn smooth by decades of hands that no longer existed. When she reached the southern wall, she paused. There was a door there, locked, corroded at the hinges, but original. A faint brass plate read "Storage." She had passed it before and dismissed it. But now, standing before it again, she could feel something. Not fear, not even dread. Just pressure, like something behind the door wanted to be remembered. She picked the lock with the gentle patience of someone who'd restored more cabinets and closets than she could count. The latch gave way with a tired sigh. Inside, the air was still. A single bulb dangled from a cord overhead. Dust swirled like ash in the beam of her flashlight. Old folding chairs were stacked in the corner, alongside a moth-eaten cloth banner that read, "He is risen." But behind the chairs, half covered by a tarp, was a collection of filing boxes. She pulled one forward. It collapsed slightly from age, the cardboard soggy at the base. Inside, records, handwritten, faded, bulletins, letters. One envelope caught her attention. Yellowed, sealed, addressed in thin, neat script, to be opened in the event of my absence. Father J. Kerrigan. Emma froze. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope, breath shallow, unsure what she expected. The letter was short, the ink nearly gone, but readable. If you are reading this, then the truth has returned to the surface. I sealed the tower for reasons I did not have the courage to explain. I heard him cry out. I knew someone was up there, but I was told not to act, told to trust the silence. I failed. I was young. I was afraid. And when I finally went up there, the door was barred from the outside. I thought he had escaped. I wanted to believe that. I built my ministry around that hope. But hope does not erase guilt. If you have found him, forgive me. Emma lowered the letter into her lap, the words echoing against everything she'd already suspected. It wasn't just neglect. It was abandonment. Someone heard, someone knew, and someone chose to do nothing. Outside, the wind picked up. Leaves scattered against the cracked, stained glass. She stayed there for what felt like an hour, reading and rereading the words, trying to understand what it meant to be told not to act. Who had told him? Why? She returned the next morning to find the tower cordoned off again, this time by a crew from the coroner's office. They worked fast, methodically. Emma kept her distance, observing from the far end of the nave. When the remains were lifted from the stones, there was a moment barely noticeable, where the entire church seemed to exhale, like it had been holding the body in too long, like it too had needed release. After the crew left, Emma stood alone under the empty tower. The silence was louder now. The bones were gone, but their imprint remained, like a chalk outline on the soul of the building. That evening, she called the county archive again, asked for any living members of the St. Matthias parish from 1966. The clerk was slow, polite, and helpful in a way that felt almost suspicious. "There's one man," he said, "Jacob Reese, used to maintain the property, still lives in town." He gave her the address. A yellow house, faded shutters, porch sagging under the weight of time. Emma knocked. No answer. She knocked again. Eventually, the door creaked open, revealing a man in his late 80s. Wrinkled face, clouded eyes, but alert, and when he saw her, he didn't look confused. "You came about the tower," he said, as if greeting something he'd always feared might show up. Emma nodded. "I need to know what happened." He invited her in with a trembling hand and a slow walk back to a plaid couch covered in plastic. "I was 28 that summer," he began, staring into the middle distance. "Didn't know much. Cleaned the church. Locked up after service." Father Kerrigan was kind, quiet, but there was something unsettled. He got jumpy after July. Stopped going up the tower. Told me not to either. Emma sat quietly. "I remember the night it happened," Jacob continued. "A sound. I was locking the side door when I heard it. A scream, maybe. Or a plea. It came from up high. I looked at the tower window and saw movement. Just for a second." He paused. "Next morning, the door was nailed shut. Father Kerrigan never mentioned it. Just said the tower was sealed, forever. Told me to board it and forget." "You never asked questions?" He shook his head. "I was young. I obeyed, but I never forgot that sound." Emma reached into her bag and handed him a printed photo. The pendant, cleaned and magnified. He stared at it a long time. "I saw that before," he whispered. "I cleaned it off the floor once, back when I used to dust the altar rail. Thought it belonged to a child." Emma's voice was low. "It belonged to him." Jacob looked at her, tears forming in eyes that had stayed dry for decades. "No one came for him," he said. "No one asked. That's what I remember most. Not the sound, not the fear, but the silence that followed." Emma sat with him until the light outside dimmed. No more questions, no more details. But one truth had become clear. Someone cried out in that tower. Someone died without a name. And an entire town had chosen to turn the page. Emma would not. And when she stepped outside into the wind, she could swear the church behind her let out one more breath, as if it knew she was still listening. The sky hung heavy with clouds the morning Emma returned to the archive, a low ceiling of gray that pressed on the town like a memory it didn't want to remember. The trees along the road to the municipal office were already turning, early autumn creeping into the tips of the pines like rust into metal. She parked, gathered her binder of notes, and walked inside with her boots still damp from the night rain. The clerk at the front desk didn't raise her head. She just gestured toward the back room, where Emma had spent the better part of 3 days combing through yellowed folders and crumbling film reels. It was there, between rows of brittle cardboard boxes labeled Parish Records, St. Matthias. that she found what she didn't know she'd been looking for. A photograph. Tucked inside a church bulletin dated June 12, 1966. It was black and white, slightly warped, with edges that curled like dried petals. The image showed a crowd gathered in front of the altar, young couples, children in white, and a priest mid-blessing, hands lifted. But behind them, barely in focus near the rear of the pews, stood a man, not part of the congregation, not smiling, standing apart, arms folded, his face half in shadow, half lost to blur. Emma stared. He didn't fit, not just because of his posture, because of his presence. He seemed still in a photograph full of motion. She flipped the bulletin over. Typed in faint ink on the back were the words, "Baptism, June 12, 1966. Marcus, guest." That was it. No last name, no explanation. Just a name with a question mark, like someone had written it down out of obligation, but not certainty. Marcus, a man who showed up that summer. A man who was never recorded in the parish directory. A man who vanished after July. Emma took the photo to the microfiche reader. She scrolled through the summer editions of the St. Matthias Gazette, her eyes scanning headline after headline about bake sales, Sunday drives, and fishing tournaments. Then, on July 16th, 1966, just 2 days after the last documented bell ring, an article caught her eye. Mass canceled Sunday. Structural repairs underway at Tower. She leaned closer. The brief piece explained that Father Kerrigan had halted service that week due to a loose floor panel and concerns over recent vibrations in the bell tower. No mention of Marcus. No mention of a scream. No mention of a man dying slowly, chained beneath the roof. Just vibrations. Emma printed the article and added it to her folder. By late afternoon, she was driving north of town, gravel crunching beneath her tires as the GPS led her to a nursing home tucked behind a ridge of maples. She hadn't been sure he'd still be alive, but the records had confirmed it. Father Jonathan Kerrigan, age 92, retired. No known visitors in over a decade. They let her in with a waiver and a visitor's badge. The nurse on duty walked her down a linoleum hallway that smelled of lemon polish and resignation. Room 14B. The door was ajar. Inside, an old man sat facing the window, his frame narrow beneath a plaid blanket, his hands folded in his lap like someone waiting to be judged. Emma stepped inside. Father Kerrigan? His head turned slightly. The eyes were pale but focused. "I'm Emma Ward," she said quietly. "I'm working on the St. Matthias Restoration Project." Silence. She reached into her satchel and gently placed the photo of the baptism in his lap. "Do you remember him?" The priest stared down at it. The skin along his cheek twitched. "No one ever asked," he whispered. Emma pulled up a chair. "Was his name Marcus?" The priest nodded once. "He came to the church in early June," he said, voice gravelly but steady. "Said he needed a place to stay, that he was fleeing something. I never asked what. We offered him a cot in the back storeroom." "Did anyone know he was living there?" "The altar boys, maybe. The groundskeeper. But he kept to himself. He was kind, quiet, prayed with the congregation, but never took communion." Emma leaned forward. "Why was the tower sealed?" Father Kerrigan didn't speak for a long time. His eyes drifted toward the trees beyond the window, where the wind shook the branches like a hand unwilling to let go. "There was an incident," he said at last. "Late July. I was in my office when I heard shouting from above. Then, silence." Emma's heart beat faster. "I ran up," he continued, "but the door was locked, barred, from the outside." He closed his eyes. "I didn't open it. I let it be. I told myself maybe he'd escaped through the side, that maybe he was gone, that it wasn't what it seemed." Emma felt her voice tighten. "But it was." Father Kerrigan nodded. "I told Jacob to board it the next morning. I never told the bishop, never filed a report. I thought I was protecting the church, but I wasn't. I was burying a man." Emma didn't know what to say. The confession had no crescendo, no cinematic weight. It landed like dust, quiet, undeniable, and irreversible. She rose, slowly. "Thank you," she said, her voice thin. The priest didn't reply, but as she reached the door, he spoke again. "There was something he said to me one night, just before it happened. He said, 'Some people believe God only hears the loudest prayers, but I think he listens to the ones whispered through walls.'" Emma stepped out into the corridor, her throat dry. She didn't look back. Later that evening, back in her motel room, she took out the pendant once more, held it in her palm. This man, Marcus, had lived in silence, died in chains, and had been erased from record, but not from truth. She turned on her laptop, opened a new document, and began to type. His name was Marcus. He came in June. He was never meant to stay. But someone made sure he couldn't leave. The keys clicked softly under her fingers, like echoes of a bell no one had heard for decades. But someone had heard it. Someone always had. The fog came in heavy that morning, rolling through the Pine Valley like breath from something ancient. Emma drove with her headlights on low, the road winding towards St. Matthias, now familiar, even comforting in its silence. The town hadn't changed, not really, but something in her had. She no longer moved like a stranger here. She moved like someone chasing an unfinished sentence. The church looked smaller in the mist, like a memory of itself. The steeple blurred into the sky, its hollow cross barely visible. She parked near the rear doors and stepped out, the air damp and cool against her skin. Her boots made soft indentations in the wet grass. In her coat pocket was a folded page, Father Kerrigan's confession, signed in a shaking hand. She hadn't turned it in to anyone, not yet. Today wasn't for closure. Today was for the tower. She hadn't returned to it since the coroner's team had removed the remains. The floor had been reinforced with temporary scaffolding, and the tape had come down. But no one else had gone in. Not the sheriff's department, not the diocese. The church remained sealed by nothing but apathy. Emma stepped over the entry frame and felt a chill slide up her spine. Without the bones, the space felt emptier, but not lighter. She moved carefully, the smell of iron and mildew still lingering. The ring where the shackle had been fastened was now bare, a patch of scraped stone where they'd cut it loose. The floor still bore faint marks where his body had rested, not scratches, not trauma, just memory etched into silence. She circled the room slowly, eyes tracing brick and timber, looking not for remains, but for echoes, for what had been left behind in a place designed to amplify sound. Her fingers trailed the wall. She paused at the northwest corner. One stone, near the floor, didn't quite match the others. Lighter, less eroded. She tapped it, hollow. Kneeling, she dug her nails into the mortar, pried gently, carefully. It took minutes. Then the brick loosened, and behind it, nestled in a cavity just large enough to conceal, was a small, weather-stained box. Wooden, unmarked. The latch had rusted shut. She sat down cross-legged on the cold floor, heart thudding like a drum deep beneath water. The air in the tower seemed to pause with her, like it knew what she was about to touch. The latch gave with a creak. Inside, barely preserved, lay a small, leather-bound journal. Its pages curled and water-stained, but still legible in places. There were only a few entries. She turned to the final one. July 13th, 1966. I don't know how long I've been locked in. My mouth is dry. My fingers tremble. I tried calling out again last night when I heard footsteps above, but no one came. I think they heard me. I think they chose not to. I was only supposed to stay in the tower a few nights, just until they could find me a safe place. I think they changed their minds. The church still rings the bell every morning. They act like nothing's wrong, but I can hear the service through the floorboards. I can hear them singing while I fade. If anyone finds this, please, please tell someone I was here. My name is Marcus. Emma closed the book with both hands. Her jaw clenched. Not to hold back tears, there were none left, but to hold back the storm building in her chest. This wasn't abandonment. This was betrayal. This was deliberate. Marcus had died beneath the sound of hymns and prayer, alone in the dark, while people sang inches above his head. They had known. They had chosen not to act. She stood slowly, hands shaking as she slipped the journal into her satchel. Back in the nave, the sunlight had begun piercing through the stained glass, casting patches of color across the dusty pews, blues, reds, greens, all bending and shifting as the wind nudged the light. Emma stood there, letting it wash over her. Then she walked, not to her car, to the back of the church, to the foundation where the bricks dipped slightly, where the coroner's team had found the iron ring. She dropped to her knees and began to knock on the stones. Soft, patient. It didn't take long. Behind the third stone, she felt the same hollow resonance. A second cavity. Her fingers worked the mortar loose with care that felt almost sacred. Inside this cavity was a cloth pouch. She pulled it free. Inside the pouch were two items: a tarnished metal chalice and a folded scrap of linen, part of a communion cloth. There was a smear of dried blood on the hem, and tucked beneath them a single page, typed, official letterhead, Saint Matthias Parish, 1966. To whom it may concern. Marcus is to remain in protective holding until further notice. He is not to be allowed communion or contact with parishioners. Father Kerrigan is to maintain silence on the matter. This directive comes with the blessing of the Regional Council and shall not be challenged. Deacon R.C. Emma stood so quickly, her knees cracked. The letter fluttered in her hand like a warning. Protective holding. Not asylum. Not shelter. Detainment. She stepped outside, lungs aching, heart pounding like hooves in her rib cage. Her breath came in sharp bursts as she leaned against the stone railing and looked out over the valley. Below, the town carried on. People walked their dogs. Someone unloaded groceries. A teenager smoked on the church steps across the street, oblivious. No one knew what had been buried in the tower above them. No one had ever cared to know. Emma took out her phone. She opened the photo of the pendant, then the scanned baptism photo, then the journal page, then the directive, and she knew. It wasn't enough to archive this. It had to be witnessed. She would write it, every piece, every silent scream, every unrecorded hymn. She would submit it not just to the preservation board, but to the newspapers, to the diocese, to anyone who would dare read it. This wasn't restoration work anymore. This was resurrection. And as the sun finally broke through the clouds and struck the bell tower at last, Emma turned toward it, knowing she would never again walk through its doors the same. The bell hadn't rung in 60 years, but in that moment, she could almost hear it. The newspaper picked up the story 3 days later. Not the headline Emma had imagined. Not something sensational. Not "Man chained beneath bell tower" or "Church secrets exposed after 60 years." Just a quiet article buried near the bottom of page 3 in the Arkansas County Chronicle. Preservation project uncovers long-forgotten mystery at St. Matthias Church. But word spread faster than the ink could. Within a week, local historians began calling. A true crime blogger requested an interview. A retired schoolteacher mailed in an old class photo from 1965, claiming she remembered a young man who never looked quite like he belonged. She thought his name might have been Marcus. By the end of the second week, the diocese reached out, not with outrage, not with denial, but with silence. A single email from an administrative assistant at the diocesan office. We acknowledge the findings at St. Matthias and will review any historical records as they become available. No statement, no apology. Emma didn't care. She hadn't written her report for them. She'd written it for him. The pages were published online, then passed around in forums and local radio segments. Her narrative included every piece of evidence she'd found. The letter from Father Kerrigan, the hidden directive from Deacon R.C., the handwritten journal from Marcus. She included scanned images, transcriptions, even photographs of the pendant, now cleaned and resting in her coat pocket, like a piece of someone's unfinished story. And then something unexpected happened. People started coming back to the church. Elderly parishioners, curious locals, journalists. A woman who had once sung in the choir stood beneath the old stained glass window with tears in her eyes, whispering that she remembered someone named Marcus helping stack chairs one summer Sunday before he was just gone. A middle-aged man showed up with his teenage son. He said he'd grown up in town, but never dared enter the tower. He asked if he could see it now, just once. Emma unlocked the side door for him and watched as he stood beneath the beams where the bell used to hang, hands in his pockets, eyes on the floor. He didn't say anything. But when he left, he took a flower from the overgrown garden and placed it beside the patch of exposed stone where the shackle ring had been. That was all. But it was enough. The town, in its own way, was beginning to remember. By the end of the month, a group of volunteers, students, retirees, and 2 local carpenters offered to help Emma restore the interior of the tower, not to erase what had happened, but to make space for it. They sanded the floorboards gently, preserving the darker patch where Marcus had laid. They polished the banister that led to the upper window. They installed a simple bench in the corner, just beneath the light, where dust always danced at sunrise, and on the wall, mounted at eye level, they placed a plaque. The words were Emma's. Here lay a man who was forgotten. Here he is remembered. But the most important change came not from the church, but from the people who had once been its silence. They started to speak, one by one. At first, it was soft. A letter from a woman in Georgia who once attended a summer camp hosted at St. Matthias. She said she remembered being told not to go near the tower, that someone bad was up there. A voicemail from an elderly man who worked for the diocese in the 1970s. He confessed that there had been whispers, internal memos that vanished, warnings never followed. He'd been afraid to speak. He said he wasn't anymore. Then came the email from the grandson of Father Kerrigan. He didn't defend him. He just said, "Thank you for writing it down." Emma didn't reply to any of them. She printed their words, filed them in a box, and placed the box in the church library where the communion robes used to hang. A living archive, a growing memory. But what stayed with her most was Jacob Reese. The old caretaker called her one morning, voice thin but urgent. "I want to show you something," he said. She drove out to his house that afternoon. The sky was clear for the first time in days, the clouds having finally broken like held breath. Jacob met her on the porch, hat in hand. "I kept something," he said. "I shouldn't have, but I did." Inside, he led her to a back room, dark, musty, wallpaper peeling at the corners. From a closet, he pulled out a wooden box and opened it carefully. Inside was a Bible. Not new, not old exactly. Worn in a way that suggested love rather than neglect. "It belonged to Marcus," he said. Emma ran her fingers along the edge of the cover. "I found it weeks after the tower was sealed, hidden behind the altar rail. I never turned it in. I thought maybe someday someone would come for it." He looked at her. "You came." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Back at the church, she placed the Bible on a small shelf beside the journal. No glass case, no velvet rope, just reachable, touchable, real. The final act came in October. The town agreed to hold a memorial. They didn't call it a funeral. They didn't have a body. But they had a name. They had a voice, and they had the truth. The service was short. No sermons, no eulogies. Just the sound of a single bell rung once from a portable frame brought in by the carpenters. It echoed through the church, then drifted out into the trees. That night, Emma stayed late, walking the nave alone. She sat in the last pew, staring at the altar lit only by the moonlight bleeding through stained glass. She didn't pray, but she did whisper. Not to a god, to Marcus, to whoever he was before the silence, to the part of him that waited under chains and stone, not for rescue, but for someone, anyone, to say, I see you. And in that final breath of stillness, just before she rose to leave, she could swear she heard the creak of footsteps above. Not threatening, not cold, just present. And finally, after 60 years, not alone. If this story moved you, if you believe Marcus deserved to be remembered, then don't let silence win. Click subscribe to support stories that were buried for too long. Share this video with someone who still believes in truth, and leave a comment below with just one word: remembered. Because sometimes the most powerful justice is simply not letting someone be forgotten.